just a story from, I'm so impressed by Mr. Horner's background, whether he's under the water, maritime historian, which led him to this pursuit of Amelia Earhart and the enigma surrounding her story. So we're here to celebrate the Earhart Enigma, and I do believe you'll win that prize. I do. So with that, if you'll join me in a warm round of applause for Dave Horner with the Earhart Enigma.
I got it.
Oh, you gonna use this one?
Yeah, I need this. Thank you, Cynthia.
Pleasure.
And thanks to each and every one of you for coming in this afternoon. And I appreciate your presence, and I hope you enjoy some of my stories. I'm rated G, or at least PG. I wanted my wife to hear that. That's the new rating. So I hope you won't be disappointed. During the 1920s and 30s, Amelia Earhart was an inspiration to men and women alike. She not only was an attractive daredevil of the air, she was America's sweetheart during the golden age of aviation. In her attempt to be the first female to fly all the way around the world along a course paralleling the equator, she selected Fred Noonan, a dashing, blue-eyed Irishman who had been the lead navigator of Pan American Airways. He charted and plotted all the courses from California to Hawaii to Manila and so forth in the Far East. The two flyers disappeared on July 2, 1937, and unfortunately, nothing was heard or seen, supposedly, after that date. In my book, I cite numerous references to radio messages having been sent, as well as people on land that identified both the navigator and the pilot. So when they did disappear, it saddened the nation, entranced with the daring and charm of these two people. The Coast Guard and Navy both stated unequivocally they just ran out of fuel trying to search for a small coral atoll called Howland Island, where Amelia had talked to Eleanor Roosevelt about getting her husband to have a runway made for. There were no other airports anywhere within 500, 600 miles in that part of the world. So she prevailed upon her friend, and I think a few of President Roosevelt's advisors also thought it might just come in handy someday to have an airstrip there in the middle of the Pacific. And who knows what the Japs might be up to 600 miles away in the Marshalls. If you look and see where I'm talking about, Howland Island, right on the equator in the central part of the Pacific, which is a pretty big ocean. And they had tried initially. Amelia left from Oakland and flew to Hawaii on her first world attempt, managed to crash the plane on takeoff from Hawaii, and it had to be shipped back to Lockheed in California for quite a few repairs. 6 weeks transpired, a lot of work was done. The mechanics worked day and night with no extra overtime to get their sweetheart of the air back in the air. And this next trip left from Oakland to Miami, and she went around the back door. And I'm giving you a little background here so that you'll see how big that Pacific Ocean is. Many of you already know it, but it is a tremendous piece of water. And here she is saying goodbye to her husband, George Putnam, after they reached Miami from Oakland. And she's headed south to South America and then across the Atlantic and around sort of the back door into Australia and New Guinea. The date was June the 1st. And here she is, the end of June, arriving in Lae, New Guinea, having stayed in Australia for about 5 days checking engines and the gasoline flow and the radio. The welcoming committee is out for her. And again, she was double checking the engines and the radio, which gave her a little problem. This is the last picture taken of Amelia, shown in the plaid, and Fred Noonan on the right, her navigator, pictured with the wives and some of the gold miners up in the large mining section. It was a section of New Guinea. Actually, what they were doing is following the streams running down from the mountaintop and picking up pretty large nuggets of gold. The gentleman right here on the left is, I forgot his name, but he was one of the largest startup gold mines in New Guinea. He picked up several other operations along the way, and today his company is known as Barrick Gold, the largest gold mining company in the world. So you can see how small beginnings can be pretty interesting results. I want you to pay attention to this lady here is the wife of Tommy O'Day, the pilot who flew these folks down from the mountain upper reaches to the coast to wish Amelia and Fred bon voyage. And you see the little pearl ring with a gold cluster that she's holding and getting ready to present it to Amelia. Amelia had no jewelry on this trip, just the wristwatch that's shown there. That ring comes into play about 3/4 into the book, and it's a fantastic story. The last words Amelia said to her husband were, "I shall hope we get the hazards of navigation behind us, and it will be a lot better." And here's the Electra with the red tail and wings underway. The takeoff at Lae was an interesting experience. Lae, New Guinea, had a dirt airstrip, mainly to serve the gold miners up in the mountains. It was on the Gulf of Huon, and the airstrip was precisely 1,000 yards long. And as the story goes from the locals, Amelia had backed that tail right up into the jungle and gunned the throttles, and the plane is rolling down the strip, getting as much power as possible, and she sees the end of the runway coming up and the water out in front of her. There was a perimeter road around the edge of this airstrip, and she hit that perimeter road and jumped in the air, and the plane went up and then it came down, and the horrified spectators watched the propellers churning the seawater, trying to gain altitude. She almost lost it right there. The plane had more fuel in it than it had ever had in any of her trips. It carried 1,150 gallons. And there was also a separate tank on board, about a 100-gallon tank for high-octane fuel that she liked to use for takeoffs, but Lae, New Guinea didn't have high octane, so she got the most out of what she could get. This is one of the most important slides and charts that you'll see today. Here's Lae, New Guinea, tucked into the Bay of Huon here. And here's the course that Noonan plotted, 078 degrees from Lae to Howland Island. The distance was 2,556 miles from Lae to Howland. The takeoff was 10 a.m. that morning. He wanted to leave at a time, they knew they'd be flying all that day, all that night, and he wanted to get to Howland the next morning after sunrise, which was at 6:15. Along about here, 5:15 in the afternoon, Amelia radioed Lae operator and gave their position, which they knew precisely because they could sight the Nicomannu Islands and they had passed Bougainville. This was 5:15. They didn't know about the thunderstorms they would encounter in another couple of hours. And they did know that the only other landmark they might have would be Nauru Island, a British possession that had agreed to turn up the lights for the phosphate mining full blast as an aid to navigation for that evening. And they would pass Nauru sometime around midnight. It just so happens that the next morning, the police chief of Nauru did state in his morning report that he heard Amelia calling in lights in sight the previous night about midnight. So we do know that the lights did help her on her trip. The Ontario was standing by along there, somewhere in that region. It was the oldest tug in the U.S. Navy at the time, coal-powered. And one of the seamen stepped out on deck about 11:30, 11:45 for a cigarette break, and he did say in his report that he heard an airplane overhead. And I'm sure there wouldn't be another airplane there. So apparently she got a beam of Nauru. The next islands would be the Gilberts and the Vero and Nairobi. There were no lights or anything there, but if it was daylight, she could see them. But they would be encountered probably about 2 a.m. to 3 a.m. in the morning. Sunrise at Howland was at 6:15 that morning. So here Amelia is leaving Leh. She's flying from yesterday into today. She left on July 2, and she's arriving at Howland on July 2, thanks to the international date line, going from yesterday into today. It was her idea to take a rest there. Some of the young colonists from the Kamehameha School for Boys in Honolulu who were helping with some of the mining and some of the runway preparation had gone to a lot of trouble to fix up the place for Amelia to rest, and each one of them was trying to offer or plan to offer his bunk to her if they had the opportunity. Unfortunately, as things turned out, she didn't give them that pleasure. Coast Guard cutter Tasca was standing by Howland Island. Here it's pictured in Hawaii, and they were maintaining radio communications with Amelia as she approached this coral strip. This is what the gift that President Roosevelt gave her, with the island being about 1.5 miles long and 1/2 mile wide. It's obvious that she would try to come in either from the south or the north for the longer runway, probably. The principal occupants of Howland were thousands of goony birds and frigate birds. And it made building those runways awfully difficult because of the guano everywhere on the coral rocks and the tractors and graders that came in. The poor guys there working had to jump in the sea about every hour or two just to get all that white guano dust off of them. And then with the hot sun, they developed boils, and it was one mess that you don't read in the history books. But I thought you'd like to see it because it's the only airport that I know that's never seen an airplane. As soon as the disappearance occurred, the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard stated that she had probably run out of fuel and crashed in the sea, not being able to find the landing strip to put down on. And Roosevelt ordered a fighting armada from California to go to the scene. This is the aircraft carrier Lexington with 40-some planes, and it left San Diego at full speed. The battleship Colorado was just pulling in to berth at Hawaii, Honolulu. It was on a ROTC training cruise, and when the cadets found out that they were being diverted to go look for that lovely mistress of the air and save her, they were quite excited to participate in this activity as well as their training program. I want you to pay particular attention to the to the observation planes there on the stern of the battleship. These were had two seats, one forward, one aft. They flew at 90 miles an hour. The only navigational gear they had on them was a magnetic compass, and they did have a two-way radio that was operated only by code, and there was an observer that flew in the back seat, but they covered a lot of territory in about 2 weeks to try to find any item that might have come from Amelia's plane, and not even a fuel slick was spotted. When she and Noonan left not only America, but just disappeared like that, it just saddened men and women throughout America. In fact, around the world, people were following the story in the newspapers and in the movies soon afterward, and even the Japanese followed the search for Amelia very, very interestingly. In time, the disappearance would be accepted, but it left a trail of rumor, error, deception, and denial that leads right up to now. Today we have the benefits of information technology. We have deep water search capabilities. We have access to archives once closed. And this author's insistence on learning the truth. So I'd like to invite you now as we get into this dramatic period in U.S. history that is easy to overlook in light of the wars and the drastic cultural upheavals that came afterward. But this was before flying became as common as taking a bus. But most of all, and I'm trying to work up to this, it was before the American public knew much about what its government said and did as it does now. About 6 weeks after the disappearance, an Australian newsletter began to drop some hints that American planes, even though they had been asked by Japan to stay away from their islands that had been awarded them after World War I for fishing and agricultural purposes only, they said they'd be glad to help, but you guys from the U.S. stay out of our waters. But it did give America a chance to do some eyeball searching anyway. One of the most interesting drawings that I have in the book is this one, because Pan American Airways ordered its station attendants, particularly at Wake Island and at Midway Island, to stand 24-hour watches until further notice. And the Wake radio chief was very diligent in this, and he wrote several interesting reports that stated unequivocally that he had a bearing from Amelia's signal 2 nights in a row. And this is the drawing, 144, each time, each night. The Midway Island operator was pretty positive. He wasn't as diligent, and he wasn't as certain, but he had a bearing that approximated where the bearings cross there near Millie. Millie is at the very southern tip of the Marshall, that section of the Marshall Islands. And this is a drawing that shouldn't be forgotten. Some people that would like to tell you otherwise would say it's impossible for a downed airplane to send out an effective radio signal when it's on the ground, on a beach, on a reef, without a trailing antenna. But I found an annual report from the English Society of Sunspot Study. And I didn't know much about sunspots, but apparently they said the summer of 1937 in the Central Pacific was probably the highest period of recognized sunspot activity, which permits radio waves to be carried for extreme long distances. And these guys with Pan Am were pretty good, and they were sure that they had Amelia's signal. I just think that the naysayers ought to read that royal observation from England, because that made me feel a lot better, at least. Now, I want you to jump with me half a world away to the lovely beach town of Soulac-sur-Mer, France. It's just south of the Gironde River entrance, a 2-mile-wide river, this big, beautiful river that flows through this section of France into the Burgundy region. There was a lady that day taking an afternoon stroll right before dinner, about 5:15, 5:30. Her name was Geneviève Barat. She was 37 years old. I'm not sure how old the little beagle is, but I'd like to know. It's a cute little doggy. And she sees this small bottle washing ashore. Being a curious lady, Geneviève steps down and picks it up and takes it back up to the boardwalk area there at this little beach town and works the cork loose. It was just in front of a beach bar named La Pergola, where they specialize in oysters on the half shell and cold beer and wine. And here's one of the oyster shellers right here, if you'd like to talk with her. The picture was taken in 1929. And there is La Pergola. They had weddings there once a week in the summer and so forth, right on the beachside. People in tuxedos out there walking through the sand. And it's likely that Geneviève either sat in one of those chairs or very near there. In the bottle was a tightly rolled piece of paper and a lock of golden brown hair. And it was written very neatly in caps in French. And it says, for those of you who can't read French, have been a prisoner at Jaluit, Marshall Islands, and in this prison have met the American aviatrix, Amelia Earhart, believed to be dead, and her mechanic, he said, but he said they are being held in this prison for espionage, as am I. And I stopped at Mille Atoll for repairs to my yacht, and they sunk my boat, massacred my crew, 3 Maoris, because I had a TSF, a radio transmitter on board. I've now, and then he goes on to the writing on the back page, verso, same thing. Their fingerprints, I thought they might be Amelia's, but FBI helped me prove otherwise. But he says, whoever finds this message, I shall attempt to throw it overboard on a Japanese ship whose name I don't know, but I've been pulled out of jail and put on this as a cold stoker, fed very poorly. I shall try to drop this message off of Santander, which is the north coast of Spain and very near France. And he said it should reach it should reach the coast by October 30th, the end of the month, 1938. And that's exactly what happened. So he was a good sailor. He knew the currents there, and you can see they're quite definite in the fall of the year. He went on to say, I shall try to escape if possible. when we near the coast. I don't know how he planned to escape. The water temperatures there average about 55, 58 degrees at that time, fall of the year. So if he planned to swim ashore, he probably wouldn't make it. But then the Germans came in June of 1940, and La Pergola was torn down at their demand, for it was impairing their view of the sea. They didn't waste any time on the beach. You can see what the curve of the beach going up to the Giron River, and the fences that are putting in there to thwart any evasion. On this particular day of this photograph, Field Marshal Himmel, with his back to us, is checking out that large gun. That cannon had a range of 25 miles, I'm told. On the back of the message is what this sailor begged. Please take it as soon as possible, whoever finds it, to the local gendarmerie. Well, the local gendarmerie at Saulac-sur-Mer was of great help to me just a few years back. It had a new building there. Some of them recalled the report that was filed that went to the French equivalent of the FBI in Paris. And along about the end of the year, copies from the French embassy to the American embassy in Paris were sent. I have copies, all of that, and they're in the book. They don't appear in any other Earhart books. They don't appear in any of the extraordinary files that are in the U.S. Navy Yard there at Washington concerning Amelia. And that in itself is an interesting part of the story. So we need to go back now to the Pacific. And you can take a look at Millie. It's a coral atoll, 20 miles long and 10 miles wide. And the most interesting thing for me is that this little island here marks the crash site of Amelia's plane and Noonan, Barry Island. This little town here was where Amelia and Fred were kept until the Japanese army came. And they were taken from Barry to Jaluyat Atoll. It's about 100 miles over, farther west. America had asked Japan to help in any way they could for searching and any information on their lost pilots. And it just so happened the Japanese survey ship Koshu was in the waters, and the wonderful memorandums back and forth between State Department and the War Department of Japan, government of Japan, were just eloquent. We will help in any way possible. Now notice the guns on both the aft end of the survey ship and on the bow back in 1937. I don't recall any of our early survey ships carrying war cannon like that. But the Koshu plays a very important role in this drama. John Heine was about 12 years old at this time. He was in the equivalent of grade school there on Jabor, the little town in the main port of Jaluyat Atoll. He was living with his parents, who were missionaries, along with his grandfather. His grandfather was the first to be beheaded because he had a typewriter in his home. And shortly thereafter, John watched his mother and father taken away. In the surrender documents of this section of the Marshals, there's reference to numerous beheadings, and there was a point there on the southern part of the atoll known as Beheading Point. John was being guarded, he said, by a Japanese soldier, not much older than he felt. But he said, you know, he must have been a Christian, because he said, if you take off and run, don't wait very long to do that. If you take off and run, I'll fire over your head. Now get out of here. This is my rendition of young John and his schoolmates, because they were given the afternoon off this particular day, and the schoolmaster says, go down to the harbor and you'll see an interesting sight, and we'll talk about it tomorrow in class. Well, everybody was happy to get out of school, at least I was when I was 12 years old. That's my man right there. This is the twin-engine silver airplane on a barge behind the Koshu. See the gun? And a broken wing. I go into great detail about how the Japanese and how the locals were able to get that plane on that barge and out from where it was, and that's a really interesting story. But it gets better. The white shirt is a fellow named Bill Primack, who's a good friend of mine. He's been back and forth to the marshals a number of times. He was in love with Amelia and wanted to find the answer himself. And he made friends with this man his arm is around. His name is Billy Mon, Amron. Billy Mon was a 16-year-old at that time back in 1937, being trained by the Japanese Navy as a medical corpsman. And one day he was rowed out to the harbor at Jaluyut to treat a tall, dark-haired, blue-eyed Caucasian man with a bad cut on his forehead and a really infected knee. And that man was Fred Noonan. When they crashed, he had previously climbed up from his aft navigation station to the co-pilot seat, and when Amelia hit that reef, it threw Fred into the window. And he was bleeding pretty badly. But the interesting thing about this is he and she were moved throughout the Marshall Islands, several places that go into detail in the book, and then they were flown 1,000 miles to Saipan, the Japanese headquarters. And everywhere I've been able to find people in each place they stopped that describe the tall man with his head bandaged and the thin, quiet, white female aviatrix. This is a bombing photo during when we hit Image Atoll in spring of 1944. You can see one bomb exploding here. And this is a drawing made of that particular area to be bombed sometime earlier so the pilots would have the targets. You see the aprons coming down into the bay here, and the seaplanes, they had these huge 6-engine monster seaplanes that could fly 2,000 miles, and they were armed, long range and well armed, with lots of bombs. And there were gun emplacements everywhere here. These are hangars. The jungle has taken over all of this. And in the air photo that I previously showed with a microscope, you can see some of those big seaplanes there. But it didn't come out very well in the photo. But you can see the impact of the bombs on the apron there. And the typical barracks that were throughout that island, and Amelia and Fred were housed for a couple of weeks in a barracks just like that today are modern housing for the residents there. Alfred Capelli, my wife, who's with me tonight, and I had dinner with Alfred and his wife in 2002. He was just named at that time Marshall Islands Ambassador to the United Nations. Before that, he was president of the College of the Marshall Islands. A very erudite guy and a neat person, and he was prolific in his commitment that yes, Amelia was there, and yes, she was in the hands of the Japanese, and yes, she was alive for a while. Queen Bosket of Mille Atolls, looking at photos of both Amelia and Fred and the airplane. And her words were, when they took the Americans, they took the plane as well. Very few Americans have ever seen postage stamps issued by the government, by the Marshall Islands, in 1987 in recognition of the 50th anniversary of Amelia's crash landing there. Here's the plane taking off from Lake New Guinea. Here's the Itasca standing by Howland Island. Here's the crash at Barry Island on Mille Atoll. And here is the Koshu, the good old dependable Koshu, taking the plane away. Apparently the author took a little levity here because they've got the plane tied to this yard, aft yard, and that yard would not hold that plane anyway. It was on the stern of the ship is where the plane was. But anyway, those are real live 1987 postage stamps from the Marshall Islands that probably very few people over here have seen. Now we're going to jump to Saipan. The invasion took place on north and south of Garapan. Here's the main city. And our guys came ashore here and here. And the Death Valley was the killing field. It was a pretty large area. And it was a vicious fight for 2 weeks. And after it got into the third week, we chased the Japs up here, the high point, Suicide Cliff. And a lot of the Japanese soldiers and officers jumped off that about 200 feet high down to the rocks below. And even a number of the locals did as well because the Japs had told them that these American Marines were real marauders. And they rape all the women and kill the children. And you've got to stay away from the American Marines. One American Marine became a friend of mine. His name was Bob Wallach. And I think Bob can tell his story maybe better than I. I got a little emotional on this. Let's see what he said.
My name is Robert E. Wallach. And I'm going to talk to you about Amelia Earhart and me finding the briefcase in 1944. One of the guys knew quite a bit about demolition. It was a demolition guy. And we had some explosives. And we packed the door of the safe and blew the doors off. I looked in and grabbed the briefcase. It was just as good or better. I grabbed it and ran off with it and opened it up. And lo and behold, it was Amelia Earhart's papers off her airplane, her briefcase she had on the airplane. I may have been just 18 or 17 or just turned 18 that month. And I said, there's something wrong. These things are bone dry. 1938, they told me they told us that she crashed in the ocean off the Howland Islands. They would have been wet. They're not wet. They're dry. I could see passports and visas and everything else that was there.
Bob described the briefcase to me, and his son was an artist, Bill, and Bill drew this. It was pretty much more of a satchel with, you can see the metal clasp that Bob described and the very heavy, secure handle. And after I had the son draw that photo for me, I found this amazing photograph in the archives of Purdue University. It was taken in North Africa you can see very early morning, Noonan with his bag, putting his nav bag there, and here Amelia with her briefcase, perfectly described by Bob. And he and I, for the next few months, he died shortly after I got to know him. He had a bad throat cancer. He had taken a hit in the invasion of Saipan and then in the landing at Okinawa. But he came back and married his high school sweetheart. They lived in Connecticut and had 6 kids. And a great guy. He and I discussed where that briefcase might be today. He had turned it in to a naval officer on the beach, gotten a receipt that said Amelia Earhart's briefcase, non-military, and he had put it in a pouch on his belt that his mother had given him. He had a few Bible verses in there, and he took a hit on Okinawa, and medics cut the pants off to get to the wound, and he found his pants or his money pouch and his receipt on the briefcase again. But we discussed quite often whether that may have just landed on some burned pile on Saipan or whether it is sitting in a Washington Beltway warehouse. Bishop Tomas Camacho retired 2 years ago as the Bishop of Saipan, but before that he translated his uncle, Judge Gregorio Camacho's testimony. And the judge said, they were brought here, the white man and woman, as spies. They were American spies, and there would not have been any trial. No trial, no photographs. Nieves Cabrera Blas, another witness, with her granddaughter Rosa, translated while Nieves spoke. And Tommy Brennan was in Saipan with his father, Buddy Brennan, who wrote a little book. He was a Houston realtor, and he wrote a little book titled Witness to the Execution. And he claimed in his book he has what he thinks is the blindfold that was on Amelia when Nieves spotted her in a little Japanese motorcycle sidecar, blindfolded, hands tied behind her, being driven down the road. And she watched where the convoy of motorcycles stopped, and some shots rang out, and she described it later. We bombed the hell out of Saipan before we even landed. And there wasn't anything there, no buildings, no trees. But this is a drawing from an early photo I found of the Kobayashi Ryokan so-called hotel. There were no bathrooms in this hotel. There were public washrooms and baths at the end of the block down the street. But Amelia was seen on this balcony a number of times and described. And as she walked down to the bathrooms at the end of the block on the Ryokan property, there were 2 small homes there with young children that she stopped, and they would occasionally give her some papaya or something. But they saw each time, they testified later as adults, they said that she looks more sickly each time they saw her, and she must have had dysentery or something, because the last few days she was going back and forth pretty regularly. This is my friend David Sellis. He's pointing to the back of the Japanese jail, and he knew what his mother knew, and his mother wasn't around when I got involved, but he said that they had made a film, a little 16mm film, not a long film, because back before the war, she knew that her third highest ranking Japanese military person on Saipan, and he had quite a story to tell. And in fact, the old gentleman came back one day after the war in the early 1980s, and he found her. and he broke down and wept, begging her to help him find the family of the American Fly Lady that they... Anyway, I think it would be appropriate to end this little show and tell with the words of his mother.
Late afternoon of December 23rd, 1993, Tankika sat in her favorite chair at her house in Puerto Rico, Saipan, while knitting decorated stuffed animals and dolls, which was her favorite hobby. She prepares to get her story videotaped of an incident she had with two elderly Japanese men who came to her residence and had the opportunity to speak about an American woman pilot executed by Japanese Army while in captive prison before World War II after her plane crashed within the Pacific region. This woman was Amelia Earhart. Tankika had summoned her son, David Celis, who requested the assistance of his brother-in-law, Ernie Bowman, to videotape her version of an actual discussion with two Japanese men who claimed they were soldiers during World War II. The following was her story. Two Japanese men came to me and one asked if I knew of a small cave located somewhere nearby. I replied with asking him, why would he be looking for this cave? Did he live here before, or did he rent a place here back then in Saipan? He answered, no, I was a soldier. When the war was to begin, we came here. My boss was the highest ranking for all soldiers. And where did you stay? He said, Saipan Studio. That was the governor's house located within the hospital area. Would you know of this American woman whose plane was disposed of here in Saipan? He said, yes. Where did they take her? Was she killed immediately? The soldier replied, no, they put her in the Japanese jail, Calabozo. What happened to the woman? He said, that day, my boss ordered me to go to another place. By the time I returned, it was close to noon. It took me long. I went far. So what? He said, after I reported to my boss of what he needed from me, I stepped out of his office and went out. One of the men in my group came to me and said, our boss had already killed the American woman. I then asked him, and where was she disposed of? He said, go to the back of the jailhouse and look there, because that was where she was buried.
There's something about Amelia that people of all ages just would not let die. The love of flying, she once said, is the love of beauty. It was more beautiful up there than anything she had known. Amelia reveled in that beauty, touching down on earth just long enough to share with us what she had experienced in the clouds. Her adoring public loved her for her smile, for her courage, for her grace. When I go, Amelia told her husband, I would like to go quickly in my plane. Amelia did not go quickly, and she did not go in her plane. She was known, however, and loved around most of the world. And I think there's enough material on her early life and now the ending of it to continue to memorialize her. I flew the Atlantic because I wanted to, she once said. To want in one's heart, to do a thing for its own sake, to enjoy doing it, to concentrate one's energies upon it. That is not only the surest guarantee of success, but it's being true to oneself. And I thank you so much for coming here today and listening to my little story. Thank you very much.